Hello and welcome back to Hearts of Iron 3 and Black Ice 10.33, and this is a naval build guide slash naval work guide on how to build fleets in version 10.33. Now, I've had the honour and the privilege of reaching out and speaking to, and I'm going to probably still butcher the pronunciation even though I did ask him how to present it or pronounce it. I'm going to butcher it anyway, but Das Gleiche, one of the two. I've said it both ways, so you can both yell at me in the comments. On how to structure fleets in Black Ice based on some of the algorithms and a little bit about the stacking penalty. So I spoke to him about commanders and the skill and how they impact it. And I also spoke to him about max fleet hull size. So very much something, and very thankful to him for helping me out with some basic information. I've got it written on a notepad while I'm playing the game. So I'm looking forward to bringing this naval guide, and it's going to be a little bit more in depth than I think my usual ones. But let's start out with some basic fleet compositions and a little bit about fleets in general and what each ship does. So naval warfare, more than probably any other aspect of Hearts of Iron 3, is very much a rock, paper, scissors based system. So you have submarines, which are countered by destroyers and other sort of anti-submarine warfare units. You have battleships that are generally countered by carriers and other battleships to a certain extent. But submarines can also, sometimes hurt them a little bit, but not to the same level. And then you have carriers that really are best beaten by other carriers. And then you have a wide variety of other ships in the middle. And you can separate those ships into sort of your convoy raiding, your anti-submarine warfare, escorts, battleships, and then your striking carrier forces. So I'm going to sort of, talk quickly about each ship and just give a quick rundown of what each ship is actually capable of and what it's normally best at doing. So, for starters, there's a few things with naval units that you want to keep in mind. Now, I personally create my fleets based on sort of three principal things, a bit like with my land forces video. I mainly make my fleets based on range and speed. Those are the two things where I look at fleets and I think, yeah, these are the two most important things, because you need your fleet to, if you've got one destroyer that can only travel 1,000, miles or nautical miles, and you've got a fleet with a speed that every other ship has a speed of 33, for example, and you put in light carriers with a speed of 25, it's going to slow the whole fleet down. There's no reason to do that. So I, like to build my fleets around those aspects first and foremost. Now, following on from that, you're going to want to build fleets with a mixture of ships. You don't want to just build fleets that are all battleships, because if they come up against things that they can't see, like submarines, they're not going to be very good at that sort of battle, so they can't counter subs. So building a fleet that's got a mixture of larger units and escorting ships is imperative. Now, I'll start at the bottom with, I guess you can say, the sort of the most basic units. So Seaplane Tenders, I wouldn't really recommend building these. They're good for, I believe, spotting. So surface detection. So they got 14 on surface detection, which probably is the highest. It is the highest, but they've got nothing else really going for them. They've got some decent submarine attack at 67, but you're getting some other units up here a bit later on that are better. To be honest, I don't see much point in building these, but hey, they've got a pretty decent range at 3,000, so they might have a use if you want a very basic unit for spotting, but again, I don't think they're that useful. The other thing worth noting with them is they are extremely cheap, and they do get you a little bit of carrier practical. So if you want to really build up carriers, maybe having a couple of these in your production queue just to keep the practical going is a good idea, but I think when we get onto later units, you'll see that these aren't needed. Now, passenger ships are your basic transport ships. Now, the one major thing about these guys is they can't land troops. So you can't use them for landing troops. They're only good for transporting troops to friendly ports. But, you know, they fit that purpose fine. They've got a pretty decent hull, so if they do come under attack, which, you know, it is unlikely, but if they do come under attack, then, you know, they might actually take a couple of hits rather than just immediately sinking. And then finally, through unlockables, you can get landing craft, and you can also get assault ships, which I don't have unlocked at the moment. Now, these are, along with the assault ships, the best units for actually landing troops on a beach. Your troops move quicker out of them. They've got normally, I think, better levels of unit capacity. So, well, actually, they've got slightly less unit capacity, but they are much quicker at landing troops. They give a couple of bonuses as well for landings. And we can look at the tech tree in a minute and have a little go through that. But they're the sort of basic landers, and they're good for their role. Submarines. So submarines are a very niche unit in my opinion. As Japan, I've not bothered to build them. The one thing that they do have going for them is they are remarkably cheap. As Germany, you can just pump these out like no one's business. And the main users of submarines that I personally would recommend are smaller nations that are just looking to do a bit of convoy warfare. And Germany and Italy. They're, I think, the primary users of submarines, because Italy in the Mediterranean can really do a lot of damage to the British supply line, and Germany, again, can do a lot of convoy damage to the UK as well, and to the Soviets to a slightly lesser extent. The USA as well has use of a decent-sized submarine fleet for interdicting Japan, but I personally don't find much use in that. And with the UK, I think your starting submarine force is more than enough for some basic convoy raiding. And I think there are other units like airplanes that probably will do the job a little bit better. And when you've got a navy the size of the United States, Japan, the UK, you can get other ships to do convoy raiding, and they'll do it not as efficiently as submarines, but pretty close to. So submarines for Germany and Italy, a great idea. The main thing about submarine, they've got pretty low visibility, so they're fairly difficult to catch, especially in 10.33 in my experience. And they are fairly powerful. Their sea attack isn't great, but 61 to 67 is, 67 is respectable. It's higher than your light cruiser, so they have a purpose, and you wouldn't really want to run these in groups of more than 3. A decent Wolfpack unit is 3 submarines. If you go any higher than that, then you start getting some penalties. So, moving swiftly on, we have the sort of start of the basic escort ships, and we have them all the way up to heavy cruiser. So we've got motor torpedo boats. I don't personally find much use for these. The main reason why I don't is their range is shocking. I mean, with a couple of techs, I've got them up to 600 with a speed of 53, so they're lightning quick. But I just don't think they're that great. They are remarkably cheap, so you can build up destroyer practical with them a little bit, but yeah, I personally wouldn't build these. They're cheap, quick to build, but I don't think they serve a whole lot of use. I am and still are toying with the thought of just building swarms of these in my Japan campaign, but I've just not got round to it. I mean, I guess it depends how cheap I can get them eventually. So, torpedo boats are the first of your sort of destroyer units. Now, again, I don't personally enjoy these. I wouldn't build them, in my humble opinion. I don't think they're that great. Their mission range is, in my opinion, their limiting factor. As you can see, 1,400 versus a destroyers of 4,000. So, I mean, maybe you want, as the UK, to build some even slightly cheaper destroyer units. Then, they've got a purpose for that. They've got decent sub-attack. They can definitely do a little bit of damage. But, yeah, I'm not sure these are the unit to go for, in my humble opinion. They're okay. They're just okay. I think that's a good way of putting it. They're perfectly fine. And they can be used to get your destroyer practical up, but just not my unit of choice. Destroyers. So destroyers are, I think, probably the best unit when it comes to naval units for what they do as a whole. They're cheap. They build pretty quickly. I haven't been building destroyers, so that's actually quite a long build time for them, but you can really knock that down, as like the UK, for example. They're good at anti-submarine warfare. They're not that great in fleet action, but, you know, they can do a bit of damage. They will not take that many hits before they go under, but, you know, they're okay. They're not perfect. Yeah, there's not much more to say about destroyers. You know what a destroyer is, what it's good at. It's good at sinking submarines. You know, I don't think I need to say much more than that. Range-wise and speed-wise, they're pretty quick units as well. So, yeah, I'm a fan of a bog-standard destroyer. I think they do the job pretty well. Light cruisers are probably the best escort ships for carrier task forces. They have pretty good anti-air attack with 4. That's actually one of the better ones for sort of a basic escort unit. They've got decent enough submarine attack, only half of the destroyer, but, you know, decent enough. But they can hold their own in a fight a little bit more in a fleet action. They're a little bit more efficient at that. And then for a different flavour, you have the anti-air cruiser, which is pretty much a light cruiser, just loses some of its sea attack, submarine attack, but gains a pretty substantial amount of air defense. So that's good. They do a decent job of air attack, and they've also got a very good air detection at level 5 there in this particular case. Speed-wise, 36 knots with a range of about 3,500 isn't too bad either. So I personally, in the later war, do like to build carrier fleets with anti-air cruisers alongside light cruisers, but, you know, we'll get to that a little bit later. Now, heavy cruisers are the cheapest sort of capital ship. Now, I believe they are classed as screens, but they are the cheapest capital ship you can buy. They've got decent enough sea attack, so they can at least do a little bit of damage. They've got pretty good hull on them, and a very good range, and a pretty good speed as well. They are, in my opinion, pretty good as convoy raiders, and they make pretty good ships to go with destroyers. So destroyers are very good at submarine warfare. You chuck a couple of heavy cruisers in, and then you've got a fleet that actually can do a little bit of damage to battleships if it does come across any. And we'll get to some of my builds and the way I've got my fleet structured in a minute. So following that, we've got battle cruisers that are... The battle cruisers are an interesting one. They're very good at convoy raiding because they have ridiculous range, and if they get attacked by destroyers or other localized units, they'll just blow them out the water. What they're not so good at is they do have a slightly lesser hull than a battleship. So they're substantially weaker in that respect. I've got a soft spot for battle cruisers. I can make the argument that you maybe shouldn't bother with them. But the main reason I'm going to tell you to bother with them is it's fun to build them. And that's something I want to get across in this guide. I play this game pretty casually. Hearts of Fire 3, a lot of people say, oh, it's too difficult, you know, it's too much to learn, Black Ice is too difficult. I disagree with that. I think if you invest a little bit of time in the game, as I think I've demonstrated on my playthroughs, I think a lot of you watching probably think I'm not the greatest player of this game in the world. And to be honest, I probably could play it a little bit more, you know, pro, if I'm going to put it in quotes. I'm going to do air quotes when I say pro. So, I think playing the game for fun is the main thing, and battle cruisers to me are fun. They're a fun unit. You can make the argument that they're not that great, but they've got decent sea attack at 99, so they will hold their own in a main engagement battle, and that's all I've really got to say about them. They're also generally a little bit cheaper to build than battleships, so you can get these out a little bit easier if you're, for example, Italy. You know, you can get out battle cruisers a little bit cheaper than you can get out battleships, and they both aid the same tech. That's one thing to say about light cruisers. They are part of the cruiser practical decay. So if you're going to be really big on cruisers rather than battleships, you're going to want to build heavy cruisers to probably be your main capital fleet assets. Battle cruisers form battleship, and pocket battleships form cruiser as well. So if you're going to go cruisers mainly, as Germany for example, pocket battleships, heavy cruisers is the way to go. I wouldn't build battle cruisers unless you want to go for battleships as part of your fleet doctrine. So speaking of the devil, pocket battleships, I personally don't see much point in these guys, but they're a little bit cheaper than the heavy cruiser, and yeah, I'm not really sure. I mean, the heavy cruisers in my game have got a speed of 33 versus the pocket battleship of 27, so I don't really see the point. My heavy cruisers have got better sea attack. Yeah, in my opinion, I don't see much point in building pocket battleships, but, you know, for convoy raiding as Germany, they're useful, but as Japan, I would avoid. But this is what I mean, it's going to depend on what nation you play. If you're playing the UK, for example, you're going to build probably a couple of battleships, and then you're going to want to build carriers. As Germany, you might actually want to build pocket battleships and heavy cruisers and things. As Italy, you might want to build battle cruisers because they're slightly cheaper and you don't have the same industrial base. And convoy raiding is going to be a pretty big part of your campaign as well. So it does depend, naval-wise, on who you're going to be fighting, on what you're going to want to be building. That's a big takeaway. So following on, you've got light carriers. Now, light carriers, in my opinion, just serve the purpose of building up carrier practical. They're pretty good. You know, you get a very cheap carrier for the cost of a CAG in it. But personally, I don't see much point in them if you can afford to build fleet carriers. If you can't afford to build fleet carriers, then you want to build light carriers, because you do want a carrier force in your fleet. It's very important to have that. But, you know, in their basic role, they're just a downsized version of a carrier. They're cheaper, so you can build them up for practical. Start building these guys, then switch to carriers, and then, you know, it'll make it a lot cheaper for practicals and for building your carriers and getting them out from an IC cost standpoint. But other than that, they're very bog standard, really. They're just a souped down carrier. So battleships, the sort of the kings of the sea. And I've always called battleships kings of the sea and carriers queens. Just, I don't know, really, just the way I say it. But battleships are... by the time World War II rolls around, battleships are not the force they once were. In the game, they're modelled pretty well. If you have a battleship on battleship engagement, though, generally the side with more battleships is always going to win. Even when you play the UK, you can be fighting the Bismarck, which technically is a slightly more, like... Generally, tech-wise, Germany will have slightly better battleships in the case of the Bismarck compared to, for example, the Queen Elizabeth class ships. But if you throw 6 Queen Elizabeths at a Bismarck and a Tirpitz with sufficient air cover, they're probably going to win pretty much all the time. I mean, subject to hull and everything. So, in my experience, at least as the UK, that's how it's always gone. So battleships are what they say on the tin, really. Heavily armoured, good for shore bombardment, and that's one of the main things that I use them for, and I'll touch on that a bit later. Pretty quick, 30 knots, very good hull, so they take quite a bit to sink them. And that's about it, really. They're quite expensive to build on IC, and they take a pretty long time as well. They're just good for blowing up other ships, really. That's their principal aim. They're not very good against submarines, as you can tell. Their sub attack is 0. So against submarines, they can do nothing. This is what I was trying to say. If you have a fleet of battleships unescorted and you fling submarines at them, they're going to do nothing to the submarines. The submarines, in return, though, will actually damage them. That sea attack of 67 is going to actually do some damage, given enough time. Super heavy battleships are just a battleship on steroids. You can tell from the stats on the screen, I don't need to say much more about this. They're the strongest ship in the game from a purely hull and sea attack standpoint. They will decimate units relatively easily. And we actually have one of these in the Yamato, which I can come back to a little bit later. So, command carrier. Command carriers and carriers in general are... Let's start with carriers. Carriers are the best unit from a purely naval standpoint. I said destroyers are the best, probably all-round unit that you're going to have numerous amounts of, but carriers are the best at doing a wide variety of roles. They can support land units with their CAGs. They can naval task force bomb Pearl Harbor with their CAGs. They can engage most fleets at a relatively good distance and win. Carriers will pretty much beat any other unit in the game apart from other carriers. That's... If we're doing rock versus sort of scissors in just purely naval standpoint, submarines beat destroyers. Destroyers get beaten by pretty much every other surface unit, but, you know, let's just say, you know, battleships will destroy destroyers. But carriers will beat down battleships like no one's business, and you can bomb them in port. Carriers are the best unit from a purely naval standpoint. They've got decent enough. They've got decent enough stats when it comes to their CAGs. They take a while to build, but they're quite a bit cheaper than battleships. But in fairness, I've had a fair amount of aircraft practical getting involved, so I don't think that's 100% a fair reflection. But you can get them to be just amazing. You put some decent commanders in carriers. 2 carriers in a group will wreck pretty much anything that comes their way. They've got decent detection, but they're not very good against submarines. So you are going to want to put them with escorts once again. And that's what the primary aim of an escort is. It just does damage to units that the carrier can't kill. So those are the sort of basics of each unit. And as I say, it's rock, paper, scissors. Destroyers counter submarines, as do light cruisers to a certain extent. Light cruisers are very much the jack of all trades. They do a bit of everything quite well. They've got good range, they've got good speed, and that's why I prefer them in my carrier groups. So let's take a little look at some basic templates. Actually, you know what? First, let's talk about stacking. So stacking as a penalty is very sort of interesting. So I'm going to put this in layman terms for you. So the max hull size for a fleet is 22. So these are your hull figures here. So if you have, for example, 4 super heavy battleships in one group, you're going to go over the hull size pretty much immediately. Same thing with battleships. So you can have really a max of, I would say, 2 battleships in a surface fleet, and then have a variety of other units to support them. And so 2 battleships take you up to 12 on the hull size side of things. Then you have destroyers, which only cost 1 each. So if you mix destroyers with battleships, you can have, let's say you mix 6 destroyers with 2 battleships. You've then got a max hull, if we take that together, what's that? That's 12 plus about another, let's call that 1.5 each, so 6 times 1.5. Quick maths in my head, about 9.5. So you're under the hull limit then. Now, if you go over the hull limit, so let's say you put another battleship in there, you're going to start getting a positioning penalty of 7.5% on each hull point or hull level above. So let's say you've got a fleet of, I don't know, 4 battleships. So they're about 6 on the hull. So in that case, they're going to be 4 points, or sorry, they're going to be 2 points over the max hull size of 22 with 24. So they would give a penalty to positioning of 15%. Now that penalty can go all the way up to 1,500%. Now, there's a lot of debate with Black Ice and Hearts of Iron on the best way to position your navy. Should you make lots of efficient units of ships, or should you just make a doom stack and just throw it together? Now, I'm not going to tell you which one is better, because I don't think there is necessarily one that's better. You're losing something with each one. If you have lots of smaller ships, you've got a more flexible navy that can do more things at once. If you have a doom stack, it'll probably destroy and smash every single thing it comes across. But you're only going to be able to do one thing with it at a time. And those positioning penalties, plus air power, etc., might actually whittle it down a fair amount. Back in the old days of Black Ice, I would argue that a doom stack was always better than making a more efficient navy with lots of units. But I think some of the changes they've made to 10.2, 10.3, and the latest version 10.33 have actually addressed that somewhat. So it's not as sort of doom stack filled as being the one way to go. And I think the AI seems a little bit better at its fleet management now. Not a whole lot better, but just a little bit better. So the main thing that you want to bear in mind is that you don't want to go over the magic number of 22 when it comes to hull. You want to try and build fleets that don't have a hull above that. Now, that can be a bit difficult to do depending on what you want to go for, but that would be the best way of doing it. Now, where admirals come in on that is, as your hull and your stacking penalty increases, your positioning ability decreases. Now, indirectly, a commander will offset the stacking penalty because they will help with positioning. So with each level of skill point, so a level 1 commander, for example, will give a slight bonus to positioning. A level 4 or 5 commander will give a much better bonus. And you can use that to offset the stacking penalty a little bit, just through the positioning aspect. So the commander is giving you a positioning bonus that you can use to offset any stacking issues that would impact positioning as a result of it. So let's give a little example here. So in my fleets here, and I do need to rename a couple of them, we have Yamato. Yamato is a level 5 commander, and he grants a positioning bonus of 50%. Now you can see on here that I've actually got a penalty, and it shows the penalty there, and the fleet's got a penalty of 26.3%. So my commander will offset that 26% with his 50% bonus. And that's why I've decided to run heavy cruisers for a change. I don't normally do that, but I'm just intrigued to run heavy cruisers. My usual setup for carriers would be 2 carriers and then all light cruisers. And then normally that percentage is quite a bit lower because heavy cruisers carry a heavier hull amount. So in this case, heavy cruisers are carrying a hull of 299 versus 261. So taking them out would remove 0.6. 0.6 would decrease that percentage slightly. Now, if we look at sort of my latest fleet, we can see it's 38% because these guys have got much higher hulls, and I need to rename that carrier, than the other fleet. And he's offsetting it by 30%. So there's actually 8% positioning issue on this fleet. So it's all about swings and roundabouts. You want to make the most efficient fleet you can. And as I say, my bog standard fleet would be 2 carriers with all light cruisers, but because I'm playing Japan, I wanted to try something a bit different because we did start with a fair amount of heavy cruisers. And I want something that if we do engage a American fleet, I've got some units that will actually hold their own against battleships. I'm not saying they'll win, but they will do a little bit more damage than just an all-light cruiser fleet would. Now, you can put destroyers in with carriers, and I would recommend putting destroyers with light carriers. Mainly because this makes a very effective anti-submarine warfare unit, in my opinion. And you're not losing too much from the speed aspect because, you know, the Hosho maybe isn't a best example. Yeah, so 23.5 with 35, yeah, actually destroyers are quite a bit quicker. But they're very good in submarine warfare roles. The CAGs will do a very good job against submarines, and then you have the anti-submarine warfare units, the destroyers specifically. So I would personally, that's how I would set up my units. Now, I am a fan of sort of 1 heavy cruiser, 2 light cruisers, and 3 destroyers as a group when I play the UK, because I think that builds up a nice sort of mix of units that can do a little bit of everything. The light cruisers can defend against air attack. The heavy cruiser, single one, can actually be used to attack German surface raiders fairly effectively alongside the light cruisers, and then the destroyers are there for the anti-submarine role. Now, in this particular campaign, I've decided to do something a little bit different to that. I have heavy cruisers, so 2 of them, with 6 destroyers, and this is going to be a fleet that is extremely good at taking out submarines, and they've got a little bit of protection if they do run into battleships. Again, they probably won't win, and we might lose a heavy cruiser, but they will at least do damage to the American fleet, and it'll make the it'll make the American AI maybe send their ships back a little bit. So that's a pretty decent anti-submarine group. You can't really just beat just destroyers with heavy cruisers. Just send them out, let them do their business. What what should we go on to next? Let's talk a little bit about transport ships. So, transport ships are not very good at being sort of... If a fleet captures them, they'll get sunk quite quickly. So I like to put a couple of destroyers with them, just to defend them a little bit, not a lot, against submarines, especially as Britain. If you're playing Britain, you're going to be relying on transporting your troops a lot. You do not want to just send your passenger ships by themselves out into the ocean and say, go for it. Half of you will get sunk and then take, the units with them. So chucking a couple of destroyers in there just gives these units a little bit of defense. Not a lot, but just a little bit. And you'll see that I've set up all of these guys like that. Now, finally, we have battleships. Now, battleships are good for shore bombardment and supporting naval landings, in my opinion. And that's the principal way I use them. They're also good for fighting other battleships. So if you can get a major battleship engagement, then sure, go for it. You want to pile all your ships into an engagement like that. And we have the Yamato here, which is actually... Is that a super heavy battleship? Don't think it's very clear, but I will assume it is. Now, Yamato is blindingly slow at 18.1. But I've supported it with a whole bunch of destroyers, so that it's got sufficient submarine protection and a little bit of air protection. And then we have some battle cruisers here that are quite quick. I've seen some people out there say they like to put battle cruisers with carriers. I wouldn't do that, but hey, each to your own. Again, you're here to have fun. You're not here to worry about the efficiencies sort of too much. So yeah, I wouldn't do that, but hey, you never know, you might want to. And in fact, I'm just gonna, because I'm a little bit funny about odd numbers, I'm just gonna chuck another. There we go. We've got a lot of ships with 8 ships in now. When it comes to making fleets, I like fleets of 6, 8, and 10. That's my sort of golden rule. You can make the argument for 12 as well, but 6, 8, 10. Anti-submarine fleets should generally be 6 to 8. Fleets of, like, battleship fleets, I like in units of 8. And carrier groups, I like in groups of 10. That's just the way I like to set them up, but, you might not want to do that. These units are pretty okay at everything. If they encounter battleships, they can go toe-to-toe with them. If they encounter submarines, the destroyers can handle that. So they're fairly autonomous. Where they will struggle is if they're under constant air attack and if they encounter a large concentration of an enemy's fleet. So if you get the Fuso and this unit, that I'm not going to pronounce, caught out by a massive British doom stack of 6 Queen Elizabeths, this is going to probably get sunk. There isn't much you can do that. At the end of the day, sometimes the best way to counter a doom stack is your own doom stack. If you play Germany, and I think I demonstrated this in my Germany campaign quite a long time ago, I built carriers, and I sank so many British battleships, and then I sank American battleships, just one after another, with just a few carriers. For sinking battleships, carriers are the best way of doing it. There's no other way about it. If you send battleships into if you send the Bismarck, the Tirpitz, the Scharnhorst, and Gneisenau into battle, all 4 of them together, with some screens against the British Navy, the Brits are going to dogpile all their units into that battle, and they're probably going to beat you. A better way of doing it is to try and pick your battles. You want to pick off the British Navy in individual engagements that you think you can win, and this is what I generally do as Italy, is I do carriers and then I pick my engagements. And with Navy, more than anything, it's more like a chess game. Each one of these tiles is a chess, a chessboard space. Your navies are your chess pieces. Your units fulfill different roles, and you need to position your fleets, first of all, in the right ports to quickly engage enemy fleets, and you then need to make sure that your fleets can get out of bad engagements if you do find them in them. So finally then, we've got my carrier groups, which are the striking force of your navy. They are the best units for taking out other naval assets, and I like to put, as I say, a fair amount of light cruisers in with them. They fulfill this role really well. Like cruisers, they've got decent range, they've got decent defense against other ships, and they do submarine warfare fairly well as well. I've put a couple of heavy cruisers in these fleets for a change of pace because I always do the same thing, and guess what? I'm having fun. That's the point of a video game, is to have fun, and you know, you don't have to be the most efficient. If you want to build battle cruisers and light cruisers and have them in a group, why not? Do it. Who cares? You know, when the hood got sunk in my British campaign, I rebuilt a new battle cruiser to replace it. I hadn't built battle cruisers or any battleships in ages, so it was probably really inefficient, but why not do it? You know, it's fun. So finally, we got our landing fleets. Now, again, follows a similar pattern to the passenger ships, except I like to put more destroyer escorts. Another class of ship that you'll probably get quite early is auxiliary vessels. Now, auxiliary vessels are shockingly awful. They're just civilian ships that have been requisitioned. But they can land troops. So as Germany, for example, the only way that you can land troops in the early game generally is with auxiliary ships. So if you're doing an invasion of Norway, you need auxiliary ships to pull it off. As you've seen from my campaign, I prefer steamrolling through Sweden and then attacking Norway. But, you know, that's a bit ahistorical. If you want to play historically, then you'll need to use auxiliary ships, and you'll probably get half of them blown out of the water, but who cares? I like to put all of the large ones together into a sort of slightly bigger fleet. I don't think it says, does it on here? So yeah, they got a transport capacity of 40. And if we compare that to a passenger ship, they have a transport capacity of 14250. So they're very similar. Now, the smaller auxiliary vessels, they don't really have much going for them. They're really, really slow. So they are useless at... These guys can get sunk like no one's business. And they have a transport capacity of only 50. So, in other words, if we take a large ship, we've got a transport capacity of 40. Oh, that's weird. I didn't know that. See, this is what I mean. I'm learning something new. The long-range ships have actually got less transport capacity. Wow. Well, you've learnt something new there, AFG, haven't you? Well, I was about to say that the smaller ships, you know, these ones with slightly less range don't have the same transport capacity, but that would have been a flat-out mistake. So, good job I checked it, isn't it? Now, for my landing fleets, we do start with a single assault ship. So it might be good to bring both of these up and then compare their stats. Now, this is quite an old ship, whereas this one's had a few upgrades. So let's just see what their transport options are. So 125, 107. So as you can see, much better on the transport capacity. Amphibious invasion speed on these units is better. Now, you compare that to the auxiliary ships. Let's compare it to these ones because they're the ones I used most often. They're actually remarkably slow by comparison. So, yeah, the best way, really, I think, of landing troops is to use landing craft. They're the most efficient. In later war, you can maybe switch to assault ships, but it might not be worth doing that. And as you can see, I've put together a few fleets that will purely be for the purposes of landing troops. I've got a couple of units to transport my Marines to attack Guam and other targets. I guess, really, it's with Navy more than any other thing, you need to plan in advance what you're going to be building. Unless you have the industrial base of the United States, in which case you can build whatever the fuck you want. But as Japan, I've gone very cruiser and very carrier. That's the way that I've decided to go, because we've got a lot of destroyers at the start of the game. We've got a few battleships already, and the main thing that I'm going to be using battleships for is in a support role. And I guess it depends what you want your Navy to do. Do you want your Navy to be battleship focused but in a battleship strike role, or do you want your battleships to be a supporting role? And pretty much every time I put my battleships in a supporting role to do shore bombardment and to protect naval landings, and if they need to engage in a naval battle, if there's one that comes up, I mean, you've seen this in my UK campaign if you've been watching a while, then I would use my battleships for that role as well if needed, and I would just chuck them in. They are a blunt, brute force instrument of death. That is what the battleship is for. Carriers are a little bit more surgical. You pick and choose your fights. You bomb enemy ports. You do a little bit more sort of micromanagement intensive battles. Whereas with battleships, just sort of point the British fleet at something and go, there, blow it up. That's the way of looking at it. I think I've covered pretty much all of these aspects. One final thing I did want to talk about is rank. So rank doesn't really impact the skill of a unit, but it does impact how many ships they can command. So Umi Tigami can command 3 ships with a rank of 1. But you rank him up to 4 and he can command 10. And I think that's the maximum. Now, speaking to Das Gleiche, who is the Black Ice mod developer, it appears that it might be an oversight to have a max command of 10 ships. The max command is an arbitrary number, apparently, and it doesn't seem to impact anything too much. It does sort of cause some minor bonuses, apparently, in rank. If you're a slightly higher rank, your admirals will level up slightly slower, but it doesn't seem to be that much of a material impact from speaking to him. But as I say, I think that's everything. For just, you know, battleships, 2 battleships, 6 destroyers. I don't think you can really go wrong with that. But hey, mix things up. You want to put 4 battleships together with only, you know, with a stacking penalty? Fine, go for it. Submarines, groups of 3. Just groups of 3 submarines is the best way to do it. And I don't really have any other notes on that. Now, from a tech standpoint, carriers are the most tech intensive. They, in my opinion, because you're not just researching carrier tech, you're then also researching this naval doctrine tech. You're then also having to research air techs for CAGs, and you're having to research the carrier techs and the air techs anyway. Now, you're going to be doing a lot of these anyway, so there's going to be a little bit of overlap. But carriers are the most tech intensive, but they're the best units when you get them out. So you've got to weigh that up. Battleships, or we'll do them in chronological order. Submarines are good for convoy raiding really only, and I've not invested in any of the techs, as you can see here. I've just not bothered with it. Submarine torpedo doesn't impact... Yeah, it doesn't impact submarines at all. So, oh, sorry, it doesn't impact CAGs or destroyers and things. So, yeah, not much point in my opinion. If you're gonna... When I come to approach a campaign, I pick at the start what techs I want to avoid if I have low leadership. Playing as Germany, for example, you don't have low leadership, but you might not want to be investing in carriers, for example, because of the amount of time it takes to get those techs up. So, as Germany, you might want to focus on submarines only, because all you're worrying about is this tree and this doctrine tree. So it's about picking what you want your fleet to do. What's the doctrine you're going to be going for? So escorts wise, this is destroyers. I don't think I need to say too much here. I think these techs pretty much speak for themselves, and you get a variety of different ship classes. The UK, you want to rush to get frigates, because frigates are really good in anti-submarine warfare roles. They're probably one of the best units at it, so I would recommend them. They're the ultimate sub-killers after destroyers. And we've talked about the other ships. Landing troops, so again, these are bog standard and you're going to want to get these techs. There's not that many of them. Cruisers, so you can choose whether or not you want to go cruiser heavy or destroyer heavy. Cruisers take more tech points, I guess you could say, because you compare this tree to this one, and destroyers are a lot cheaper. So there's an argument to be made, just don't bother with them. But I like cruisers. I play them for flavour. You know, the UK probably should just go destroyer only, but that's boring. Why not do a little bit of both? Capital ship wise, here's your battlecruiser and battleship techs. Again, not much to say here. As the UK, if you wanted to play most efficient, probably just build destroyers and battleships. That's probably the best way of doing it. Maybe carriers as well chucked in. You've got another load of text here, including what steel you pick. So as Japan, I've gone for the one that decreases hull slightly, but it does decrease the IC cost of your units, and that's because I've only got limited IC. As the UK, I would pick cemented, and the United States go for the special treatment steel. I've never seen much point in that. I think cemented armor is the best armor option, unless you're playing Italy, Japan, or France. In which case, I would go for this because of the IC build cost decrease. You can probably make an argument for Germany as well, picking this. But Germany should probably have very quality intensive ships. And maybe Japan should as well. I probably should have had Japan with maybe better steel to build extremely high quality ships. But I think the IC decrease is worth it in this case. Carrier, as you can see, has a lot of text. I would go for the torpedo bomber focus, but you can get pretty much all of these. And then you've got a choice to make between closed and open hangar. Closed hangar makes ships stronger, is the best way of putting it, and open hangar makes you be able to hold on to more CAGs. That's the long and short of it. Escort carriers are very good at anti-submarine warfare. That's the, you get escort carriers, frigates together, and you've got the ultimate ships for taking out submarines. They're the ultimate hunter-killer groups, as it says there. Finally, you have Doctrines. So, Doctrines are what makes your ship's organization better. So there's no reason not to do these. As you can see, I'm in the middle of doing Carrier Task Force, and I'm hoping that'll unlock the CAG size increase, because I've actually built some extra CAGs because I want my ships to have like 3 CAGs in each, but I don't honestly know if that's going to work or not, because I'm not very good at understanding that. It says CAG size increase naval doctrine at least 1, lower than 2. So it says have country flag impossible. So I don't really know what that means. Like, I don't know. It's not very clear, to be honest. I'm hoping that when I unlock this, that'll unlock. I mean, that's just the way it looks to me. So hopefully I'll be able to get increased CAG size before the War of America. But that's the end of this naval guide. Once again, I want to thank Gleiche for his help on a little bit about the stacking penalty. I hope that it's been useful for you and it's given you a few ideas on how to make up your fleets. And in the next episode of the Japan campaign, we'll be picking up from here, and I'm going to go over the OBE and our current situation and what some of my plans are for attacking America, because we're not that far away from that now. And I've done a fair amount of work off camera to reorganize my army, get my units in position, and start filling out ready for attacking America, the UK, and the Dutch East Indies, including Australia and New Zealand. So thank you very much for watching. I look forward to seeing you in the next episode. Thanks again. Bye bye.